Any player, umpire, or club, or league official or employee who shall bet any sum whatsoever upon any baseball game in connection with which the bettor has a duty to perform shall be declared permanently ineligible. Permanently ineligible. That's posted in every clubhouse in baseball, isn't it?
A lot of players don't pay much attention to the fine print.
But that's not fine print. That's not infield fly rule. That's not.
It's not as big as you.
It's not when a game becomes official and whatever. That's the most important rule. That's the rule that goes to the integrity and to the authenticity of the game. So.
Well, first of all, I've never been a multimillionaire. Okay, don't forget when I played. Don't forget when I played. I didn't play today. If I played today, I'd be a multimillionaire.
You're gutless. That is the kind of thing people shout when they argue about Pete Rose. Nobody wrote those words into an official ruling. They do not come from a hearing or a report. They are just the sound of a fight that has never cooled off. And it is a fight about a man who did almost everything baseball asks a player to do. Pete Rose collected more hits than anyone who has ever played the game, 4,256 of them. He won 3 World Series titles. He played like every single at-bat was personal, and he made a whole city believe that effort could beat talent. Then baseball closed the door on him. Not for a season, not for 10 years, for good. So how does a sport shut out its own hit king and then keep him out for the rest of his life? Before we go further, do one small thing for me. If you want more baseball stories like this one, use the hype button on this video and give it some hype. It helps push the video out to people who have never heard the full story. Now let's get into it. Because the answer starts in 1989. Start with what he actually was, because the rest of this story means nothing if you skip it. Pete Rose played 3,562 games in the major leagues. That is not a good season or a hot streak. That is a career so long it covers whole eras of the sport. He was the heartbeat of the Cincinnati team known as the Big Red Machine, one of the most complete and dominant groups baseball has ever put on a field. He was not carried by that team. He set its temperature. He was not the biggest man on the diamond or the most gifted athlete out there. What he had was refusal. He refused to give away an at-bat. He refused to jog anywhere. He piled up those 4,256 hits by showing up every single day and squeezing more out of himself than anyone believed was in there. That is the man baseball threw out. In 1989, Pete Rose agreed to be placed on baseball's permanently ineligible list. That agreement came after an investigation into betting on baseball, including games involving the Cincinnati Reds while he was their player manager. Read that last part again. Not another sport, not horse races or football, baseball games. Games involving his own team at a time when he was the man filling out the lineup card. To understand why that ended his life in the sport, you have to understand one rule. It is called Major League Rule 21. It is not buried in a legal book somewhere. It is posted on the wall of every big league clubhouse, in English and in Spanish, where every player can see it every single day. Rule 21 has 2 levels when it comes to gambling. If a player, umpire, or club official bets any amount on a baseball game that he has no part in, he is out of the sport for 1 year. If he bets any amount on a baseball game that he does have a part in, he is out permanently. There is no sliding scale. There is no discount for stars. That rule was not invented to trap Pete Rose. It was written long before he was born, and it came out of the worst moment in baseball history. In 1919, 8 members of the Chicago White Sox worked with gamblers to throw the World Series. The sport nearly did not survive it. Fans had to ask themselves whether anything they watched was real. Out of that crisis came the commissioner's office, and Judge Kennesaw Mountain Landis was handed almost total power to throw people out of the game and win the public back. Ever since then, the commissioner's main job has been simple to describe and hard to do. Protect the belief that the games are honest. Understand what that old scandal really cost. It was not just 8 players losing their jobs. It was every fan in the stands afterwards wondering whether the rally they had just watched was real. Once that doubt gets in, it does not leave. A sport can survive bad teams, bad owners, and bad seasons. It cannot survive an audience that has quietly stopped believing the result. So the rule was built to be blunt on purpose. No judgment calls. No room to argue about how much you bet or why. Bet on a game you are part of, and you are finished. That bluntness is the whole point of it. Now think about what happens when a manager bets on his own team. Rose said for years that he only ever bet on the Reds to win. He said it like it settled the argument. It does not. A manager who has money riding on a Tuesday night game is no longer making decisions for the season. He is making decisions for that game. He might leave a tired relief pitcher out there for one more batter. He might use his best bench player early instead of saving him. He might move a starter around. None of that looks like cheating from the stands. All of it can quietly damage the team on the nights when no money is on the line. There is something worse, and John Dowd, the attorney who ran the investigation, pointed it out clearly. When a manager bets on most nights but skips certain nights, the bookmaker notices. If the manager will not put money on the game when a particular starting pitcher is going, that silence says something. It tells the gambling world that the man in charge does not like his own chances. That is inside information leaking straight out of the dugout and into an illegal market. Rose himself once said that if he had been caught using illegal drugs instead of gambling, baseball would have kept him as manager of the Reds and paid for his rehab. He said it as a complaint. But hidden inside that complaint is the exact reason he was treated differently. Drug use damages the person who uses. Gambling damages the thing everyone is watching. One is a personal failure. The other reaches into the scoreboard. That is the line baseball believed Pete Rose crossed. Not a rule about behavior or image. The one rule the sport treats as untouchable, and the story of how he crossed it and how the sport made sure he never came back runs through 9 people. We are going to count them down, starting with the man who had the last word. Number 9, Rob Manfred. By the time Rob Manfred became commissioner, the 1989 ban was old news to most fans. Rose had been out of the game for more than 25 years. A whole generation had grown up hearing about the Hit King without ever seeing him in a uniform. There was a growing feeling in public that enough was enough. He was older. The sport had changed. Sports betting was becoming normal and legal in places it never used to be. Surely the punishment had done its work. And the timing made that argument stronger than ever. Baseball itself was signing deals with betting companies. Odds were showing up on broadcasts. The sport that destroyed Pete Rose over gambling was now living beside it in public. To a lot of fans, keeping him out looked less like principle and more like stubbornness. Manfred could have used all of that as cover. Letting Rose back in would have been popular. It would have closed an old wound and given the sport a feel-good moment it did not have to work for. In 2015, Rose filed a formal application for reinstatement, and Manfred did not brush it aside. He reviewed the case carefully. He even met with Rose in person and listened to him directly. That matters because it means what came next was not a rubber stamp of an old decision. It was a fresh look by a new commissioner, with every reason to want the story finally closed. On December 15, 2015, Manfred rejected the application, and the reasons he gave were far more damaging to Rose than anything from 1989. First, Rose admitted that he was still gambling on sports. It was legal gambling now, so it broke no law, but Manfred saw it as proof of something deeper. A man asking to be let back into baseball while still betting on sports was showing that he did not really understand why the sport feared gambling in the first place. He was treating the whole thing as a technical problem he had already served time for, rather than a risk he needed to stay far away from. Second, Rose could not present a believable plan for how he had changed. Reinstatement is not a reward for waiting. The standard asks whether the person understands the damage he caused and has genuinely reformed. Manfred concluded that Rose had not shown either. Third, and this is the part people forget, reinstatement would have meant deciding that Rose was fit to be employed in Major League Baseball again, not honored, not forgiven in some warm public way. Employed, put back inside a clubhouse, around players, around the competition itself. Manfred decided he could not reach that conclusion. That is a higher bar than most people picture when they hear the word reinstatement, and Rose never seemed to aim at it. Pete Rose died on September 30th, 2024, at the age of 83. He was still on the ineligible list. He had spent 35 years asking, arguing, selling his story, and waiting, and the door never opened while he was alive. Then something strange happened. On May 13th, 2025, Manfred issued a ruling that changed how baseball reads the word permanent. He decided that being on the permanently ineligible list ends when the person dies. His reasoning was cold and logical. A man who is gone cannot threaten the honesty of a game, and a punishment that lasts an entire lifetime with no relief is about as strong a warning as any sport can send. That ruling removed Rose from the list. It also removed Shoeless Joe Jackson and 15 other dead men. But read carefully what it did not do. It did not say Rose was innocent. It did not undo baseball's judgment about what he did. It was not a pardon. Manfred simply drew a line between punishing the living and judging the dead, and handed the question of Rose's place in history over to the Hall of Fame committees. So the record is exactly this. Pete Rose was never forgiven by Major League Baseball. He was only released by death. Number 8. Tommy Lasorda. To understand why baseball never softened, you have to understand the generation of baseball men who set the tone. Tommy Lasorda was one of them. Lasorda managed the Los Angeles Dodgers for years, and his teams battled Cincinnati constantly in the National League West. He was loud, emotional, and completely wrapped up in the sport. He was also the exact opposite of Rose in one important way. Rose spent his career pushing against the establishment. Lasorda was the establishment. Lasorda believed something that sounds old-fashioned until you think about it. He believed that anyone who put on a major league uniform took on a duty to protect the reputation of the game, not just to win, not just to perform, to protect. The uniform was borrowed, not owned. You wore it, you passed it on, and you did not damage it while it was yours. From that point of view, what Rose did was not one bad decision. It was gambling on baseball, and then years and years of denying it in public while the sport carried the weight of the story. That combination is what old-school baseball men could not forgive. The betting broke the rule. The denial broke the trust a second time, and the denial was not quiet. It went on in public for years, in front of cameras, while other men in the game were asked to answer for it. Every manager who came after had to face questions about Rose. Every Reds team had to carry the story. The people still working inside the sport were the ones absorbing the damage while the man responsible sold his side of it. Lasorda's view was not unusual. It was the mainstream opinion inside the game's leadership, and it explained something people miss when they argue about Pete Rose. This was never one commissioner with a grudge. The people who ran baseball, managed in it, and built their lives inside it mostly agreed on the same thing. Keeping Rule 21 absolute mattered more than keeping any single superstar. Once you allow one exception, the rule stops being a rule. It becomes a negotiation, and a rule you can negotiate with is worthless as protection. That is the wall Rose kept walking into. He kept making his case as a great player. Baseball kept answering as an institution. Number 7. Mike Schmidt. Now step out of Cincinnati for a moment, because there is a version of Pete Rose that people outside Ohio saw up close. Mike Schmidt played with Rose in Philadelphia, and together they won the 1980 World Series. Schmidt was one of the best players of his era, a star in his own right, which means he did not need to be impressed by anybody. And he was still impressed. Schmidt once described Rose as the most likable, arrogant person he had ever met. That line is worth sitting with because it captures the whole problem. Rose was cocky, and somehow you liked him anyway. He talked about himself constantly, and it did not push people away. He had a pull that made teammates play harder and made strangers defend him for decades. That charm is a real part of the story. It is why the argument about Rose never died. Schmidt himself pointed out over the years that baseball fans stayed split right down the middle on him. Half the sport wanted him back. Half the sport wanted the line held. That split never healed, and it is worth asking why. Most scandals fade because the public loses interest. This one did not, because Rose stayed visible. He signed autographs. He gave interviews. He kept the case open himself, year after year, and every appearance reminded people to pick a side again. Schmidt was honest about his own doubts, too. He sometimes wondered aloud whether a lifetime ban was too heavy compared to the way baseball handled players who use steroids. That is a fair question, and it is one fans still ask. But even Schmidt, a friend and a teammate, landed in the same place in the end. He called gambling a crime against baseball itself, different from other kinds of cheating, different from other kinds of scandal, because it goes after the one thing the sport cannot replace, which is the belief that what you are watching is a real contest. So here is the contradiction at the center of this story. Rose's fire was genuine. His teammates felt it. It made average players better. Nobody in this story pretends otherwise. And that same career, built on that same fire, ended up permanently attached to a gambling scandal. One does not explain the other. Nobody has ever shown that competing hard made him bet. But both are true about the same man, and baseball had to decide which one mattered more when it came to letting him back in. Number 6, Tony Perez. Now back to Cincinnati, and to the part of this story that actually hurts. Tony Perez was one of the pillars of the Big Red Machine. He and Rose were teammates through the greatest run in Reds history, when that club was as close to unbeatable as any team gets. Those men did not just work together, they grew up together inside the sport. Perez never turned cold about Rose. Long after the ban, he still spoke about the exile with real sadness. Not anger at baseball, not defiance. Sadness. The kind you carry about somebody you actually love. But Perez also said something about his old teammate that cuts deeper than any criticism from an outsider. He pointed out the painful irony in it. The thing that made Rose great on the field was his absolute belief that he could beat any obstacle in front of him. Any pitcher, any slump, any team, any score. He never accepted that a situation was hopeless, and that refusal is exactly what turned an average body into the all-time hits leader. Off the field, that same certainty stopped being a strength. Perez believed Rose thought he could outsmart Major League Baseball, that he could handle the investigation the way he handled a two-strike count, that if he denied it long enough and pushed hard enough, he would find a way through. He could not. There was no way through. The institution was not a pitcher he could wear down. An investigation does not get tired in the ninth inning. It does not lose its nerve when you stare at it. All the tools that made Rose unstoppable in a batter's box were useless against a stack of bank records, and he seems to have been one of the last people to realize it. That is why the Perez view stings more than the harshest attack. It does not accuse Rose of being a bad man. It says the quality everyone celebrated was the same quality that walked him off the edge. Number 5. Johnny Bench. If Rose was the engine of the Big Red Machine, Johnny Bench was its foundation. He was the best catcher in baseball, the anchor of the dynasty, and one of the two faces every fan pictured when they thought about those Cincinnati teams. Bench never played down what Rose brought. He respected the work ethic completely. He talked about how Rose's constant hustle lifted the entire roster, how it dragged other players up to a higher level just by being there every day. That is not a small compliment coming from a Hall of Fame catcher who saw everything. And yet Bench never became a campaigner for Rose's return. He did not lead the crusade fans expected from a friend. His reasoning was simple. The rules of Major League Baseball apply to everybody. That was the whole point of them. No player, no matter how many hits he piled up, gets to be the exception. If Rule 21 bends for the hit king, it means nothing for anyone else. For Bench, the real tragedy was not the punishment. It was what the punishment did to something bigger than Rose. Those Reds teams belong to a lot of people. Bench, Perez, Morgan, and everyone else who built that dynasty earned their place in history. But once the gambling story broke, it cast a shadow over all of it. Every conversation about that era now has an asterisk hanging in the room. Every documentary has to stop and deal with Pete Rose before it can talk about the baseball. That is a cost Rose's teammates never agreed to pay. They just had to live with it. And notice what Bench did not do. He never attacked Rose. He never pretended the man was not great. He simply refused to argue that greatness should buy an exemption, and coming from someone who shared a clubhouse with him for years, that refusal carried more weight than any outsider's opinion ever could. Number 4. Joe Morgan. Joe Morgan was the smartest player on those Reds teams, and one of the greatest second basemen who ever lived. He was also a Rose teammate for years, and he cared about him. He also became one of the clearest voices in baseball on why the line had to hold. Morgan's position was not personal. He kept his affection for Rose the man and the player, but he refused to bend on Rule 21, and he refused to bend on what the Hall of Fame is supposed to measure. For Morgan, a plaque in Cooperstown was never just a receipt for numbers. The moment that really sharpened his view came in 2004. For 15 years after the ban, Rose denied everything. He wrote a book in 1989 insisting he was innocent and that the investigation had been unfair. He built a whole public identity out of that denial, signing autographs and selling memorabilia while the argument stayed alive. Then, in 2004, Rose finally admitted it. He had bet on baseball, and he had bet on the Reds. That should have been the turning point. Instead, it made things worse, and Morgan explained exactly why. Rose did not stand up at a press conference and apologize to the sport and to the fans he had lied to for 15 years. He put the admission inside a book and then went out on a tour to sell it. The confession arrived with a price tag on it. Morgan said plainly what forgiveness requires: real remorse, a full confession, actual repentance, not a product launch. Years later, in 2017, Morgan turned that belief into action. He was serving as vice chairman of the board of the National Baseball Hall of Fame, and he sent a letter to every Hall of Fame voter. The letter was mainly aimed at players linked to performance-enhancing drugs, but the argument underneath it landed on Rose just as hard. Morgan's point was that character, integrity, and sportsmanship are supposed to count, not as decoration, but as a real standard. If people who broke the sport's rules and never truly repented walk into Cooperstown anyway, then the plaques of the men who played inside the rules quietly lose value. That is the argument Rose could never beat. He kept answering with statistics. Morgan kept asking a different question entirely, and Morgan was not some outsider looking for a headline. He had stood beside Rose in the same infield, won with him, and traveled with him. If anyone had earned the right to make excuses, it was him. He did not. Number 3, Tommy Gioiosa. Everything so far has been about how baseball felt. Now we get to why baseball was so certain. Because a rumor cannot end a career. Evidence can. And the evidence against Pete Rose was not one witness with a story. It was a network. Tommy Gioiosa was close to Rose in a way most people never are. He lived in Rose's household. He managed a Gold's Gym in suburban Cincinnati. He was part of the daily life, not a distant acquaintance. During 1985 and 1986, Gioiosa served as Rose's main runner. That word matters, so let's be clear about what it means. A runner is the person who carries the bet. Rose would not have to call a bookmaker himself. Gioiosa placed large baseball wagers on his behalf with Ron Peters, an established bookmaker operating out of Franklin, Ohio. Think about the design of that. A runner is not a convenience. A runner is insulation. It puts a person between you and the illegal market so that your name does not appear in the transaction. That structure only exists when somebody understands that what they are doing has to stay hidden. Nobody builds a system like that by accident. You do not need a middleman to place a legal bet on a horse. You need one when the bet is a problem. Gioiosa's own life did not end well. He was later convicted and sent to prison, partly for his role in protecting Rose during tax evasion proceedings and separately for drug offenses. That is a real weakness in the case, and it is worth saying out loud. Investigators were relying on people with serious legal problems of their own. Rose's defenders have hammered on that point for decades, and they are not wrong to raise it. But there is a reason it did not save him. A man who bets through runners does not get to complain that his runners are not respectable people. Those were the associates he chose. The company he kept became the record of what he did. And there is a second problem with that defense. Investigators were not asking anyone to take these men at their word. The testimony was a starting point. What made it dangerous was everything that lined up behind it. Number 2, Paul Jansen. In 1987, the job passed to somebody else. Paul Jansen was a bodybuilder who became Rose's main betting go between that year. And Jansen is the single most damaging figure in this entire story because of what he brought when the investigation came calling. Jansen was facing federal tax evasion charges connected to steroid sales. He had every reason to cooperate, and he did, completely. He gave testimony. He handed over daily betting logs. And he had secretly recorded conversations that dealt with Rose's gambling debts. That is the difference between gossip and a case. Logs and tapes do not change their story under pressure. A witness can be discredited. A witness can be accused of chasing a deal or settling a score. A daily log of bets is harder to argue with because it either matches the phone records and the bank records or it does not. Jansen was not alone either. There was Mike Bertolini, a sports memorabilia dealer in New York, who Rose used to place bets with a Staten Island bookmaking operation. Records that were seized later showed Rose writing checks for $8,000 to made-up names in order to settle gambling debts through Bertolini. And there was Ron Peters, the Ohio bookmaker, who testified directly that Rose placed baseball bets with him, sometimes over the phone himself and sometimes through his runners. Now here's the part that made the whole thing impossible to explain away. Telephone records showed Rose calling bookmakers and runners from the manager's office at Riverfront Stadium from the ballpark. On game days, calls went out as late as 6:40 in the evening for games scheduled to start at 7:05. The amounts were not casual either. Rose typically wagered $2,000 a game. He often bet several games in one day, which pushed some days as high as $18,000. Over time, the losses piled up, and his debts ran past $500,000 to bookmakers connected to organized crime networks. Read that back and hold it next to Rule 21. A man managing a major league team, betting thousands of dollars on baseball from inside the stadium minutes before first pitch, while owing enormous sums to dangerous people. All of this ended up in a document called the Dowd Report. It ran 225 pages, backed by 7 separate volumes of exhibits, and it laid out Rose's betting across the 1985, 1986, and 1987 seasons, while he was player manager and then manager of the Reds. The report was challenged. Bill James, the most respected analytical mind in baseball, argued that it leaned too heavily on compromised witnesses and that the physical proof tying Rose specifically to baseball bets was weak. That criticism carried real weight, and it kept hope alive for Rose's supporters for years. But later reviews of the report, including detailed work by the journalist Derek Zumsteg, showed that the criticism had misread how the case was actually built. Dowd never rested on witnesses alone. Bank checks lined up. Phone records lined up with game times. Betting slips carried Rose's own fingerprints. The pieces confirmed each other, and then time settled it completely. In 2004, Rose admitted he bet on baseball. In 2015, a court-confiscated notebook belonging to Bertolini surfaced through ESPN, filled with daily entries from the spring of 1986. That was Rose's final season as an active player. It showed betting on baseball games, including the Reds, while he was still putting on a uniform and stepping onto the field. The Dowd report was not a witch hunt. It was early. Number 1, Bart Giamatti. Which brings us to the man who had to decide what to do about all of it. The investigation began in early 1989, when Commissioner Peter Ueberroth and incoming Commissioner A. Bartlett Giamatti appointed a Washington attorney named John Dowd to look into the rumors around Rose. Dowd delivered his report in May, and it became public the following month. Giamatti had been commissioner for only a short time. He did not choose this. It arrived on his desk, and it involved the most popular living player in the sport. Rose fought hard. He filed a lawsuit in Ohio State Court trying to stop baseball from holding disciplinary hearings, arguing that Giamatti had already made up his mind. It was a serious legal threat, and it could have dragged the sport through court for years. So on August 23rd and 24th of 1989, the two sides signed a 5-page document called the Agreement and Resolution. Under its terms, Peter Edward Rose was declared permanently ineligible under Major League Rule 21 and placed on the permanently ineligible list. Rose dropped all his legal action and accepted the authority of the commissioner's office. Baseball agreed to end its investigation and to make no formal finding of guilt, and Rose kept the right to apply for reinstatement after 1 year. That last piece is important. The ban was never technically forever from day one. It was permanent unless baseball decided otherwise. The door was locked, but a key existed. The no formal finding clause is also why the argument never ended. Rose's side treated it as proof that nothing was ever proven. Then Giamatti walked into a press conference minutes later. A reporter asked him directly whether he personally believed Rose had bet on baseball. Giamatti did not hesitate. He said that in the absence of a hearing and in the absence of evidence to the contrary, he had concluded that Rose bet on baseball. Rose's lawyers were furious. They argued the commissioner had broken the spirit of the deal. But Giamatti's answer explains everything about how baseball has behaved ever since. The agreement kept the sport out of a courtroom finding. It did not require the commissioner to pretend he had no opinion. His job was not to be a judge. His job was to protect public confidence in the games, and that job included telling the public the truth as he understood it. In his closing remarks, he called the banishment the sad end of a sorry episode, and said that one of the game's greatest players had done things that stained the sport and would now have to live with the consequences. 8 days later, on September 1st, 1989, Bart Giamatti died of a heart attack. He was 51 years old. That timing changed everything about how this story would be handled for the next 35 years. The ruling stopped being an administrative decision and became a legacy. Now, put all of it together: the hits, the championships, the player-manager filling out a lineup card with money on the game, the runners, the logs, the tapes, the fingerprints, the teammates who loved him and still would not campaign for him, the commissioner who ruled and then died, the commissioner decades later who looked again and said no. Pete Rose had one argument for 35 years, and it was a strong one. Look at what I did on the field. He is right. What he did on the field is extraordinary. 4,256 hits is not a number anybody is about to threaten. 3 World Series rings are real. The way he played is still the thing coaches point to when they want to explain effort to a kid, but records and integrity measure 2 completely different things. A record measures how well you performed inside the competition. Rule 21 protects whether the competition can be trusted at all. Numbers cannot answer that question because numbers only mean something if the games behind them were honest. This is the part that gets lost in every argument about him. Nobody in baseball ever claimed Rose was not good enough. Nobody suggested his hits were fake or his effort was staged. The sport never had a problem with the ball player. It had a problem with the manager, with the man in the office at Riverfront Stadium, making phone calls before first pitch, deciding who pitched and who sat while money rode on the result. Those are two different jobs, and only one of them broke the rule. And Rose never really accepted that difference. Yet whenever Pete Rose comes up, that number has to share the room with something else. It never gets to stand alone. Very few things in sport are heavy enough to sit beside a record like that without being crushed by it. This one was. That is the real measure of what he did to himself. So let's end where the story deserves to end. Pete Rose was one of the greatest baseball players who ever lived. He got more hits than any human being in the history of the sport. He won 3 World Series titles. He played every game like it was the only one he would ever get, and he made millions of people love baseball a little harder because of it. That is why the game can never forget him. But the same man, while wearing the uniform and running the team, bet on baseball. He denied it for 15 years, sold his confession when it suited him, and never accepted that it was anything more than a broken rule. That is why the game could not forgive him. Unforgettable as a player, unforgiven as a man inside the game. Both things are true, and baseball decided long ago which one it had to protect.